Hello, dear friends. Thursday, March 7th, 2024. How are you today? I am here with... Who's that? Dougie. Say hello. What you doing? With my little sidekick. I hope you're having a wonderful day. The temperature is about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 13 Celsius, somewhere around there. And it is just a beautiful, beautiful day. I hope you're doing well. I want to continue on today with this book called The Canadian Revolution, From Deference to Defiance. The title of this book, I don't think should be called Canadian Revolution. It should be called The Canadian Corruption. And you'll see why very, very soon. I've essentially finished off with the topic I was dealing with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. It's funny that I don't think I had really very many people support Dawkins, maybe one or two comments, but a lot more fans of Hitchens for some reason. But none of the arguments from atheists had any weight to them. I'm still getting a few random pot shots here and there, but nothing serious. In the most part, the atheists that I've been in touch with have been relatively mild and harmless, probably because I'm dealing with an older audience. The atheists that are under the age of 30 or 25 for that matter, you're probably much more likely to run into the virulent, hard left, the militant Antifa types and the vitriolic people that are threatening with really, really harsh things that are off the chart. So for the most part, I haven't had to deal with any of those, and they wouldn't be interested in listening to a boomer anyway. So the older people, the older atheists are relatively harmless. They've just reached a point of smug self-assurance, and they think that their logic is superior, and they think that they only live their lives based on evidence, and generally self-deluded in a number of different ways, and they're very meek and mild to deal with. So I'm happy about that. But let's move on. This is the second video I'm doing covering the book by Peter C. Newman. Now, it's funny because the first book that I read of his, called The Canadian Establishment, was published in 1975, 20 years before this book. And that book, when I read it, I was just bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I was just entering into the business in Toronto at the time, and it went along with the zeitgeist of the time. That was the early stages of avarice, the early stages of corporate greed and making money, see who could get the first BMW and all that kind of stuff. You're looking at the 80s time frame. This is much later. Now, this is published in 1996, so 21 years later. And in the book, The Canadian Establishment, Peter C. Newman was very favorable towards the subjects in that book, even though he might have alluded to a few minor scandals here and there. On the whole, it portrayed the captains of Canadian industry in a very, I wouldn't say a reverence, but a very positive light. Jimmy Pattison, even Conrad Black, a lot of the Westons, these rich, the Eatons or whoever, the Canadian families that had all the money and controlled most of the resources, that were the wealthiest families. He portrayed them very positively. Now, in this book, he just he doesn't hold back, and it's essentially a display of complete corruptions. So we left off on talking about, the first four chapters are very folksy, talking about the country and its distinctiveness, and talking about the railway and all the history of the railway, how it was important to Canadians, and the British monarchy in chapter 3, how that was a part of Canadian culture. And then chapter 2 was about religion. I'm surprised he put it so early in the book, but he does address religion in chapter 2, and so on. So the first four chapters are trying to give a pulse on Canadian culture. Now we reach chapter 5, and it's called Touchstones, the End of Trust. And in this chapter, he starts talking about individuals and politicians together. He starts dealing with individuals, and then he moves on to politicians a little later. But I'll try and give you a few blurbs. Here's one from chapter 5. I'm just going to share it with you quickly. I'll try and make this a very short video. Canadians wanted to rekindle their belief in institutions which could be depended upon to serve them, so that they in turn would have something to serve. They had tired of politicians who plundered the treasury for their own self-aggrandizement and institutions that served themselves instead of the people who had been elected, appointed, or anointed over them. When what they got were Brian Mulroney's excesses of partisan largesse, they got an inept banking and business community that behaved with callous indifference as its own incompetence wiped out the life savings of many a pensioner. They got, above all, the message that the social contract was no longer valid and that everyone was on their own. So this is an introduction to the next section of the book. He spends a lot of time on Brian Mulroney, starting in 85, and the semi-financial collapse in 1987, which he kind of blames largely on Robert Campo, but I'm sure there was a lot more contributing factors than just one person. But he tries to make it sound like it's only him. He really gives Robert Campo a hard time. Campo was a kind of a maniacal depressive who had a number of mental breakdowns, and he bought out a bunch of department stores across Canada and the United States, and ended up losing billions of dollars in a massive bankruptcy, and so on and so forth. So all the stories that he relates, he talks about on page 112, the death of Canadian nationalism. Now don't forget, he's talking in 1996, and he's already talking about the death of Canadian nationalism. And he's describing the end of specific Canadian identity, and kind of shifting towards being absorbed as a extension of the American marketplace, right? That it's just another place for Americans to sell their goods, especially with the influence of Brian Mulroney and free trade and so on. He talks a bit about Canadian football and how distinctive the Grey Cup is and all that kind of nonsense. And then we move on to chapter 6. And he puts this in a second section called the Economic Revolution. And chapter 6, he talks a lot about Toronto. The chapter is called Toronto, the center that didn't hold. He gives a quote here: "Money has no heart, no soul, no conscience, no homeland." That's a quote from Magna International Chairman Frank Stronach. He was known for his wild, high-flying corporate maneuvers, and he was the president of Magna International, and his daughter was quite famous as a socialite and so on. And so he goes through and talks about the movers and shakers in Toronto, how often their background is, Toronto institutions like the Upper Canada College, Albany Club, Bishop Strachan School. He goes through all the details of how the Canadian elites are brought up, how they interact with each other, and he also talks a lot about the 5 major Canadian banks. He reaches a point where he's just mentioning them by a single word. Instead of saying Toronto Dominion, he just calls it the Dominion. Or instead of saying Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, he doesn't say CIBC. He just says the Commerce, because he's using the term so often. Or the Royal for the Royal Bank, or Montreal for the Bank of Montreal. He abbreviates the name of each of these 5 banks that are constantly cooperating with the Canadian movers and shakers in their deals, and lending them money that ends up getting written off, either because that money is pillaged from the shareholders and the workers, or the workers' pension, or subsidized by government bailout, and at the same time, forcing Canadian small businesses to go belly up, either on their farms or on their small business, or losing their homes. So the Canadian banks have a very black eye as described by Peter Newman in this book. He talks about so many Canadian individuals that were known just by their first name, right? Matt was Matt Barrett, Doug was Doug Bassett, the Bada family, Conrad, of course we know Conrad Black, John was referred to John Cleghorn, Jack Hockwell, Eddie Cogan, Mickey Cohen, Jimmy Conacher, Garth Drabinsky. You might be familiar with Garth Drabinsky. He's talking about how he was just known as Garth, and he was owned a bunch of cinemas in Canada, went famously belly up, and Diane Francis is a well-known name, Hal Jackman, I'm skipping a lot of them, Peter Monk is a well-known one, Joe Rotman, Maurice Strong, Ken Thompson, of course, Galen and Hillary Weston, right? So there's a lot that I skipped, but he goes through the names of the power elites in Toronto. And don't forget, Peter C. Newman is kind of like a journalist, and he's been invited into this inner circle, and he was able to do that through publishing stories on them in a positive light, as we saw in the Canadian establishment. But now he's kind of, 21 years later, I guess he figures he's got nothing left to lose, and he's retiring, or he's made his fortunes from his previous book sales, and he can be a lot more forthright, a lot more honest to tell the sordid details of these movers and shakers in Canadian industry. And he starts by going through example after example after example of corporate greed, government greed, and just straight out theft. People borrowing money knowing they're never going to pay it back. And it's very depressing, these next 4 chapters, I must say. Chapter 7 is called The Economics of Despair, Ethical Endgame. Once men and women equated their net worth with their self-worth, the social contract exploded. Politics was what people argued about. Religion defined how they felt about the universe. Love measured their passion and commitment beyond themselves. But work was what they lived. And what do you do was the dominant personal identification code. He goes on. It's very pleasant reading because the guy is an excellent writer, but the subject matter is very depressing. If there is any naivety in regards to the ethics of Canadian business, it will certainly be scoured away by reading this book. And to think that the Canadian economy is only 10% of the American economy. Imagine how much more stories could be mined out of that industrial landscape, and especially today, or commercial landscape, I should say. He does touch on a couple of Americans. I think he talks about Michael Milken, the junk bond king, but for the 99%, he's talking about Canadians in here, right? And so just all he goes into great detail on all the, not all, but a large number of CEOs and their compensation, even when they're driving their companies into the ground, even when they're pillaging the shareholders, ripping off the employees from having a pension, they're getting millions of dollars in compensation. And this is so common. Even those that commit straight out fraud and get caught are often paying a nominal fine, not having to serve any jail time, and just, moving on to other exploits. So it's pretty sad. He gives a lot of coverage on E.P. Taylor. A lot of these business elites set up tax-free corporate entities in the Caribbean. He talks about Peter Thomas, a Vancouver entrepreneur, and all his exploits. Taylor was the last and most successful of his breed, a genuine robber baron who didn't pretend to have a conscience. I mean, he marks out Taylor for that description, but I think he could easily apply that to many others in his book. It just goes on and on and on. He does talk a bit about Michael Milken here in chapter 7. He says, The ethical endgame of business in the revolutionary decade had many players. Canada's milling industry, which seldom made news, was charged in the winter of 1990 with a scam that defied morality at any level. In the winter of 1990, with a scam that divided morality at any level, asked to fill a $500 million government contract to deliver milled grain to Ethiopia, Chad, Sudan, and other famine-stricken countries of Africa, the main Canadian mills, consisting of Ogilvy, Maple Leaf, and Robin Hood, rigged their bids to keep prices artificially high. How many starving people were thus denied nutrition couldn't be calculated, but the millers pleaded guilty and were fined $1 million each. Imagine, on a $500 million contract. Another case that set new limits to the profit motive came to light in the late summer of 1994. Imperial Tobacco, it was revealed, had commissioned a study by Professor Jean-Pierre Vidal to prove that smoking was good for the Canadian economy. Despite its $9.7 billion annual health bill, the good professor's logic was impeccable. Anti-smoking groups, he concluded, rarely consider the reduction in health costs resulting from the premature deaths of certain smokers. No quarrel there, they certainly did die young. A person who dies of lung cancer at age 70, he went on, will not be hospitalized later with another disease. But of course, silly me for thinking to disregard the economies of dying. Smoking killed more Canadians each year than traffic accidents, suicide, AIDS, and murder combined, which only proved what generous benefactors the folks at Imperial Tobacco really were, according to their line of reasoning. I can't read this part because it's going to get blocked by YouTube. So Imperial Tobacco, they funded a study to say, hey, we're saving the Canadian economy money because people that use our products die earlier and you don't have to pay to treat their other diseases that they would otherwise have got. That's the kind of morality was witnessed in Canadian business. And that's only one small example. He goes example after example after example. And then he talks about the wheat suppliers, right? The grain suppliers, Robin Hood and I don't know, that's the only name that I recognize. What were the other ones? Ogilvy and Maple Leaf. I guess Maple Leaf Foods is a large conglomerate. And they colluded to say, okay, what are you bidding on this contract? We're going to bid this price. Okay, you keep the same price. We're all going to bid the same price for a bucket of wheat that they pillaged from the farmers at dirt cheap prices in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and wherever they're getting it from. They get it on rail cars. They ship it across the country dirt cheap, paying pennies per pound of flour and wheat and corn and all these other grains, and have it shipped overseas. The Canadian government pays them $500 million, and they pay the farmers, a tiny fraction of that, and the rest goes into their pockets. And then they get caught colluding, so they pay $1 million fine each. A slap on the wrist, nothing. Sad, sad, sad. Let's move on. I tried to make notes as I was going along for something that would jump out at me. One of them was Domtar. You're probably familiar with Domtar. That's short for Dominion, Tar, and something else. Pulp mills. I spent part of my youth growing up in Cornwall, and there was a large pulp mill in that town. You could obviously smell it. But he details, it was run by Jean Campeau. 4,000 employees. They laid off 4,000 employees, lost over $600 million. When Campeau formally resigned to go full-time into politics, Domtar's board of directors rewarded the departing chairman with a bonus of $450,000. And that's after the company losing $600 million. Domtar lost $294 million in 1990, written down the value of nearly all its assets. The company had formerly consisted of 25 profitable forest products companies, but suffered major layoffs. 1/4 of its salaried employees let go. Most of Domtar's troubles flowed from its ill-conceived and badly managed diversification policy conducted throughout the mid-1980s. And it goes into all the details of inept practices. For almost destroying what had once been a jewel of a company, the two corporate directors were rewarded with nearly $2 million in salary, bonuses, and special payments. On top of that, by the simple act of leaving, this guy by the name of Smith kicked in an astonishing pension plan designed to pay, imagine this, $430,000 a year for life, while Pinard had to scrape along on an annual pension of only $327,000 per year per life. So Domtar jumped out at me because I actually knew somebody who worked at that factory in Cornwall during the time that this would have covered. And mismanagement, having to lay off the employees, unable to pay their pensions and so on. Oh my gosh, I've gone way over time. I'm so sorry. I just kept going and going and going. He talks about the Massey Ferguson Corporation, a very famous company that made farm implements. He talks about the story of Ted Rogers and his rise to wealth and power. And of course, people are familiar with Ted Rogers very well. And of course, he spends a lot of time talking about Robert Campo. For some reason, Peter Newman really has it in for him. He says, it was unlikely that anyone with Campo's psychological profile and financial record could in fact have been hired to perform any job, however menial, if it required even the most rudimentary stability. So he just really rakes Robert Campo over the coals and spends a lot of time talking about his horrific business dealings and ineptitude scattered with corruption and on and on and on. So I'll just leave it at that. Chapter 8 goes on is called The Bonkers in Their Bunkers. If I owe $1 million, I'm lost. But if I owe $50 billion, the banks are lost. That's a quote from a fellow by the name of Chelsea Ming. And so chapter 8 deals with the bankers and their, I don't know if you saw the movie called Owning Mahoney, the guy who was a Canadian banker who went down to Vegas and he embezzled money from the bank and blew it all in Vegas. Owning Mahoney, starring, who was that actor? He's passed on now. I'm trying to think of his name. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Yeah, it's quite a excellent movie, I thought, because it was based on a true story. And he talks about the story of that guy. His name actually was Brian Maloney, not Mahoney, but, they changed the name for the movie. Says he won $450 million at the gambling tables and lost $457 million. So I guess he lost a net of $7 million. So there you have it. He talks a lot about the Reichmans, a very famous family, and you might be interested to talk about that. He mentions so many names that you'd recognize. Remember Morty Schulman of Deprenal Research? That was a big scam. Harold Ballard, he was the owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. He talks about him. He covers so many names that were in the news during the time period of 85 to 95. Talks about Jack Gallagher from Dome Petroleum. I know somebody who did contracts for Dome Petroleum at one time. So there you go, talking all about the bankers and how much they lost so much money in their loans to countries in South America, in particular to Brazil. And it goes on and on and on. It talks about the bankruptcy of Confederation Life, which was a big story during the time. And that's it. I'm going to cut it there because that's chapters 4 to 8. And we're going to just move on from there. Very depressing. There was one point where I was reading so many story after story of corruption, I started to almost physically have a negative reaction. I was getting nauseous or something. I had to put the book down. But I spend most nights reading this because I have insomnia. So I'm getting through it. Very different from the earlier book of his that I read. And I'm very thankful that he's a lot more straightforward in this one. That he is not pulling any punches. He's just letting it go and telling people, hey, man, these guys are corrupt to the core. It was an era of corruption. And don't forget, this is published in 96. So, 30 years ago. Imagine how that has expanded to today. Think of the companies today that are in the news, that are supplying governments and individuals' products and how that is being executed throughout the world. Now most of these were isolated business dealings. So you'd have a guy that had a project, he'd get funding, he would try and go somewhere and discover oil or drill a gold mine, and he would get funding for that. It would collapse, it wouldn't work. Sometimes it would work, maybe he'd make some money. Barrick Gold was successful out of hundreds and hundreds that failed. And but today, this would be times 100, because now the corporate raiders, the robber barons, are dealing on a global scale. They're not just dealing with Canada. Canada would just be 1/10 of the market of the United States, and the United States and Canada combined would just be a fraction of the global market that is being gobbled up by the wealthy elites. And they do their connections and they do their deals and on and on and on. So to try and extrapolate this out and think about how widespread corruption is in the world, it's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. And what is the core that is being talked about in this book? The core that's being talked about in this book is avarice, is greed, and theft. What is theft? You borrow money, you don't pick it back. You take money from shareholders, you don't give it back. You take money from your employees, you don't give it back. Is theft, is stealing. Thou shalt not steal. The solution is not a political solution, because the political leaders are cooperating with the bankers, who are cooperating with the captains of industry, who are cooperating with the CEOs. You have the CEOs, you have the bankers, and you have the politicians, and they're all hell-bent on achieving the same goal, that is to line their pockets with as much money as they possibly can. Make the money, get out, and leave. It tells one story of a guy. I'm over time, so I'm not going to go through it here, but just mind-boggling, the level of greed and corruption. There's no end of it. There's no end of it. The only solution is a spiritual solution, that people need to turn back to God. It says righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. It is disgraceful, the condition of the Canadian corporate landscape. It is an absolute disgrace. This book should be called The Canadian Disgrace. The Canadian Disgrace, from corruption to corruption, it should be called. And it's very sad, because that is the state of humankind. That is the state of fallen humanity. People only care about themselves. They want to get their profits. They want to get their BMW or Lexus or Lambo or whatever it is nowadays. And it is just magnified over and over and over again. And since the time that this was written, imagine the number of stories. It is absolutely sickening. And that's the state of the human heart. It's a story after story of human greed, exploitation, and lack of conscience, lack of morals, lack of integrity, lack of any type of philanthropy, or they may have token gestures to come across as being beneficial to society by making a donation and making a big deal about it. But if you think about the billions and billions upon billions of dollars that have been squandered away and funneled into their own private agendas, their yachts and their private jets and the Gulfstream 3 and the house in Miami and the house in Switzerland and the house in France, and on and on and on and on and on. It's amazing that the entire economy hasn't collapsed already. I don't know how it just maintains itself, because the people that suffer through all of this are the individual drones of society who go to work 9 to 5, supporting this kleptocracy that is pervasive and is rampant across the country. It's amazing that it's able to sustain itself. You wonder, how long is that going to last? When people are finally just going to say, "Hey, I'm not playing this game anymore." This is sickening. And where does it all end? I don't know. But Lord help us. Come, Lord Jesus, rescue us from ourselves, because we need rescuing somehow. So there you have it. That's chapters 4 to 8. I'm going to try and get through this book. It's a long slog, but it's well written, so that makes it very pleasant to get through. And he does throw in a lot of specific facts and trivia about the economy and about numbers and all that kind of stuff along the way, so it's good. Thank you for watching. God bless you. I hope you can spend time with people you love. We'll talk to you again real soon. Get out, enjoy the weather, spend time with people you love, and get some fresh air. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.